Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. It's been a huge week in the news in Israel and around the Jewish world. Zoran Mamdani, a 34-year-old Democrat and socialist whose stance on Israel has put the city's Jewish community on edge, is now the mayor-elect of New York City. In addition, the bodies of hostages killed on October 7th and killed in captivity continue to return to Israel under the fragile ceasefire agreement, including the bodies of 2 American citizens whose families waged high-profile campaigns for their return, Itai Chen and Omer Nutra. And yet, the Israeli public and media at the moment is fixated on a completely different story, a big one. This scandal has seized the headlines in Israel, and it is a complicated tale with some serious implications, but also dramatic soap opera elements, resulting this week in a surreal scene of volunteer divers on a beach searching in the sand and the water for a cell phone lost in a suicide attempt. The story of the events at Sde Teiman and by the now former chief military prosecutor Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi, who is currently under arrest, is inseparable from the larger issues that are gripping the country right now. The continued reckoning with the October 7th attacks and their aftermath and the war, and the ongoing battle by the Netanyahu government, which is doing everything in its power to attack and erode the power of gatekeepers that stand in the way of its will and its authority. 2 of those gatekeepers are the IDF and the justice system, and they stand at the center of this controversy. Here to help me explain what is known as the Sde Teiman Affair and how it unfolded and its importance is Dr. Eran Shamir-Borer, director of the Center for National Security and Democracy at the Israel Democracy Institute. Before that, Eran served for over 20 years in the International Law Department of the IDF Military Advocates General Corps. Our conversation is coming up. A special message for our listeners in the New York City area. Haaretz invites you to join us at the Other Israel Film Festival, taking place at the Marlene Meyerson JCC starting on November 6th. This year, Haaretz journalists will be hosting Q&A conversations with filmmakers, as well as taking part in a special panel on culture and freedom of the press in Israel. Haaretz readers and Haaretz Podcast listeners get 20% off of all festival tickets. If you'd like to join us there, go to the Other Israel website and use code Haaretz25. That's Haaretz and the number 25. For more information, please check the festival's websites, which we will link in the show notes. We hope to see you there. Dr. Eran Shamir-Borer, welcome to the Haaretz Podcast.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Eran, you come from the military legal infrastructure establishment in Israel, which is very unique, both in its importance in Israeli society and the Israeli legal system, in a way that I think is different from most other countries. So can you first explain to our listeners its importance, its difference, and which leads us to why this affair has really caught the attention and is now the central news headline in the country of Israel right now, despite the fact that we have so much more going on.
The Military Advocate General's Corps, that's the legal body of the IDF that provides, enshrining and instilling law enforcement within the ranks. The Military Advocate General who heads the unit, she or he are actually wearing dual hats. They're in charge of providing legal advice to the IDF on all matters on the battlefield in day-to-day life. But at the same time, they're also in charge of law enforcement. So the Military Advocate General is heading the military prosecution, and there's also the military defense. So that's all part of the same body. It's interesting to say that the unit was actually established in the midst of Israel's war for independence in 1948. So even when the new state was still fighting for its existence, Ben-Gurion and state leaders thought that you can't hold a military without also ensuring that they operate within the law. Now, whenever you take soldiers, military activity, operational activity, and the law, there always could be some friction. And obviously, very often when the law puts various constraints on the conduct of force, or when soldiers are, sometimes their conduct is scrutinized if there is allegation of misconduct, this could create friction. I think along the years, we've seen trends in Israeli society that there is sometimes, less and less tolerance to applying the law sometimes to operational activity, and sometimes also looking into allegations of misconduct. Perhaps the watershed in this aspect was the Hebron shooting incident in 2016, where a soldier, Elor Azaria, shot dead a terrorist after it was already neutralized, lying on the ground. And there we saw how politics intermingles with the law, and I think things have become more and more complicated since. It's interesting to note, comparing to other countries, there's a growing tendency, I would say, among Western democracies to take these legal body out of the militaries, and very often in many other countries, we see that it's the civilian legal system that investigate and sometimes, indict soldiers for alleged misconduct on the battlefield. In Israel, it's still within the military, as well as in other states as well. In the US, it is also the same, conducts the same way. But I think the fact that Israel has maintained the professional independence of the military advocate general and everybody working under his or her command has managed to keep the system somewhat working and enjoy credibility and legitimacy both within Israel and outside, although it's being challenged more and more. And in the IDF being a people's army, so very often social and political trajectories in the society, they also infiltrate the IDF. I think that's one aspect we need to take into account. The other one is that many serve in this way or another in active or reserve service in the IDF. So very often when there are, challenges, when the law meets the soldier, very often this is the cause for intense public discourse. And as we've seen, everything, taking place in the context of a government advancing a judicial overhaul in Israel and challenging more and more legal institutions. I think everything happening in this context, in the context also of a very prolonged war in Gaza and on other fronts. So I think this is part of the reason why we see everything amplified so significantly in this case.
Okay, so let's go over this case. It's a very long and complicated tale, and I want to get through the narrative so that you can discuss the legal implications of it and the wider implications for, as you said, the fight for democracy inside Israel. It's being called the Sde Teiman Affair. Let's establish what Sde Teiman is. It's an Israeli military base in the Negev, not far from the border with the Gaza Strip. After October 7th, its use was expanded as a large-scale detention camp for Gazans suspected of being Hamas terrorists. Gazans were held there for weeks, months. Most of them were superficially questioned and eventually released back to Gaza, which is when stories of these appalling conditions and alleged serious abuses by soldiers came out and became international news. So on July 29th, 2024, military police raid the base, take documents, question reservists suspected of abusing detainees. The reservists blocked, sometimes violently, and harassed these officers from the police who came to investigate them. And there was a call for outside help, and a mob breaks into the base. There are lawmakers from the Netanyahu government coalition in the mob, including some from the Likud. They're looking for the military police team. They find out that the investigators and some of the suspects were taken to another base. They go to that base too. And so here's where the legal aspect begins. The allegations of abuse, including sexual abuse, eventually become formalized into indictments of 5 of the soldiers. Eran, first, correct me if my narrative is not accurate, but tell us about, presuming it is, the allegations in these indictments and the state of the case. It's formally pending in court right now, correct?
it was an allegation of abuse of a detainee. As you mentioned, the initial phases of the investigation, there are also suspicion that maybe it was also involved sexual offenses, not in the sense, that it was, sexually motivated, but just the technical definition of the law. But it's important to say that eventually this didn't end up in the indictment itself. So it's various accounts of abuse. I think, by the way, that initially this is part of what created or drew much attention around the world, that IDF soldiers are a suspect of raping or conducting sexual offenses against a detainee. It draw a lot of attention, and eventually it didn't end up in the indictment. But yeah, the events that happened on the day when the military police investigators came to the Sde Teiman detention facility to question the soldiers allegedly involved. This was something unprecedented in Israeli history, right? You see a mob led by a minister in the government, members of the Knesset, just storming into an IDF base, some of them also using violence against the soldiers there. It's a physical attack on a military base. It's also, the politics gets into IDF bases, both physically and conceptually. And I think many in the military justice system just felt that they're under threat, and not for the first time. Okay, in the time that preceded this, there were demonstrations against the houses of the military advocate general, and then others, graffitis, politicians slandering them, and sometimes even inciting against them. So everything happening in a context which is already very, very much intense. So we have the alleged abuse incident itself. And then this is now, the case is still pending before the military court. Indictments were filed against 5 reserve soldiers for their alleged involvement in this incident. And another aspect of the affair now is the break-in itself. First of all, there are serious questions about where the Israeli police was on the day of the events. It took a long time for the police to actually show up. And then when they showed up to Sde Teiman detention facility, they practically didn't arrest a single person. It's important to say that later in the day, around the evening, when the suspects were brought to a different military base in central Israel, where the military court is, then again, a mob came to the base, stormed in. This time, the police couldn't even say that we're surprised or didn't have prior intelligence about this. Again, just most of the policemen just standing and not arresting anyone. The IDF chief of general staff at the time actually showed up himself to the place, and the minister of defense at the time sent a letter to the police minister Ben-Gvir saying that, blaming him for instructing the police not to get involved in this, practically not to do their job to enforce the law and public order within Israel. So serious allegations. There is a police investigation around this. The attorney general even gave green light to question as suspects some of the members of Knesset who were involved there. But it seems like it really takes a long time for this police investigation to carry out. Some of the members of the Knesset involved, they simply refused to show up at the police station, even though they were summoned to arrive there, practically abusing their parliamentary immunity to avoid investigation.
So believe it or not, this is all background to what we are actually here to discuss. And that is the fallout of a video documenting the alleged abuse, which gets leaked to Israel's major TV news station. It's suspected at first, but unproven, that the leak came from the office of the military advocate general, Major General Yifat Tomer-Yerushalmi. But investigating it is very problematic, as you've explained at the beginning, because officially it's her office that's supposed to investigate such things. She denies having anything to do with it and says that it's been investigated and they don't know what happened to the leak. But recently, we learned the non-military police and the legal system outside of the military is involved. The police learned of new information pointing at Tomer-Yerushalmi and her staff as the source of the leak video. And that's when we get the bombshell announcement last week that there's an investigation into the leak, that Tomer-Yerushalmi has been asked to go on leave. In the end, she resigns. She admits leaking the video. She takes full responsibility for passing the video to the TV news, explaining it by saying that she did it in order to push back on false allegation hurled at Israel's legal system, and she doesn't say also at her, but as you mentioned, she's been the target. The Attorney General announces that the criminal investigation has been opened by its police and the Intelligence Division, guidance from the state attorney's office. We know that the state attorney is also under fire from the current government. What she doesn't talk about, Yifat Yerushalmi, are additional claims raised regarding a cover-up of the probe into the leak and misleading the Supreme Court on this matter. And as they said in the Watergate scandal in America, where I'm from, the cover-up is often worse than the crime. That's when the soap opera Netflix series part of the drama begins. Yifat Yerushalmi goes missing, and her car is found on the beach with a suicide note in it. However, she's found on the beach, thankfully alive and well. She's arrested, but her cell phone is nowhere to be found. And that is the basis of allegations that this whole suicide attempt was staged as a way for her to get rid of a cell phone on which presumably the evidence is based. That's the quick version of the story. Before I start asking you questions about the legal side, Eran, what was your reaction to this whole saga?
To be honest, I was just, shocked. I was shocked on so many levels, First, as somebody who served for over 2 decades in this unit, a unit which has been, I think, and should be like a beacon of truth and justice and rule of law within the IDF and more broadly within Israeli society. I was also shocked, as a professional and also on a personal level, I'm familiar with many of the officers allegedly involved in this incident for many years, and I'm also very concerned, for the ramifications and consequences that this could be, both within Israel and overseas. Because within Israel, my concern is that it would be many who are trying to undermine the independence and professionalism of the justice system could just take advantage of what's happening now. It's like they won the holy grail, without even expecting it. And I'm also serious of undermining the credibility of the IDF justice system overseas. It could also have serious repercussions for Israel and for Israeli servicemen.
Can you go over what the potential crimes here that were committed by the military advocate general and her office? What are we looking at? Is, as I said, the cover-up worse than the initial crime? So what are we looking at as in terms of the possible ramifications of this case? As we said, she's under arrest right now, but has not yet been formally charged.
Right. So she's under arrest. Another very senior officer of the military advocate general, the former head of military prosecution, is also under arrest. And from what I'm reading on the media, there are other suspects as well. So I think one of the questions here is how many exactly in her circle were actually involved in this. As you mentioned, there is the part of leaking the video, which is part of the relevant materials in the investigation in the case. It could be a criminal offense. I wouldn't say, a very serious one. And there could have been other ways also to release this video without being any offense at all. What's more serious, as you mentioned, is a subsequent cover-up and allegedly also misleading the court, because, as you mentioned, there was an internal examination process within the MAG conducted by others who were, as claimed, not part of the initial decision-making processes of the main investigation, the abuse investigation. And more than that, it was even in the context of this, there were several petitions submitted to the Israeli Supreme Court by various petitioners, some of them also defendants in the abuse case. And they claimed, well, the MAG, the military advocate general, the military police, they cannot investigate the leak themselves because they're all contaminated. It should be investigated by someone else outside this unit. And before the court, the state, attorney general and her representative, they claim, well, these are people who were outside the decision-making processes. There's an oversight provided by the deputy attorney general. We think that's okay. And eventually the court, in a decision that they gave earlier this year, they accepted this. Then another petition was submitted to the court. And not long ago, in mid-September, the state responded again. This time they said, well, the internal probe has already been concluded. They exhausted all potential avenues to try to detect the source of the leak, but there's no way they could find who did this. And that's why there's also no reason to launch a full criminal investigation into the leak. And this is, lies another serious allegation here that throughout the entire time, perhaps the people reporting to the court this way, they really thought that this was the case. But at the very same time, in a nearby office sits the military advocate general herself and maybe others in her circles. And they know the truth, and they know that not all avenues have been exhausted. They know exactly how this leak came about. So this is a very, very serious claim as well, which could really also translate into criminal proceedings.
Eran, as someone who knows the system well, can you at all put yourself in the shoes of the people in this office and understand why they would risk imploding their careers as they have, undermining this system that, as you mentioned, is so, historically sound and has protected so many Israelis and that the society relies on, especially in the current political atmosphere? What would move them to behave in this way? Do you understand it at all?
Wow, Alison, over the past couple of days, I kept asking myself, what could I have done, if I were in their shoes? To be honest, I could relate to the need to try to protect, not just individuals within the military advocate general, but also to the notion of rule of law. I mean, we're living in very, very challenging times in Israel, when it comes to the rule of law. A government trying to advance the judicial overall, attacking the system, the concept of rule of law, the military justice system, the overall justice system, and those representing and heading these systems. I could relate, to the need to try to at least respond to the public, to try to explain to the public, listen, there are good reasons why the military police should investigate those suspects. There are allegations of some serious, serious crimes that happened here. To communicate the message that it's part of who we are, it's part of our value. We need to address those suspicions when they come up, because by investigating and bringing, to justice those who are in charge of misconduct, by this we say that the rest are okay, right? The attacks against the military justice system, against the military police, against the individuals representing them, they came without any response, without any support from the government or others. To the contrary, right? As I mentioned, elected officials were heading the mob storming into IDF bases. So I could relate to the need to try to explain, why that's important. Also, to respond to the sentiment in the society that when the cannons are roaring, how could you march our soldiers into the investigation room? So trying to communicate to them, no, we're not just marching soldiers to the investigation without any reason. We do this only when it's absolutely necessary, when there is a justification to do that. So I could relate to this. I think it's very, very brave, everything that happened afterwards, right? First of all, I think they should have conducted themselves in the first place more prudently, right, within the ambits of the law. But it's very, very hard for me, to understand how you create a practice and perhaps even a culture of not telling the truth, of cover up. It's very serious, right? It runs very much against of who the military advocate general's core are. And everything is happening in the context of a military framework, right? Officers reporting to their superiors, and you're not at full liberty to say, well, I think otherwise. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to quit, and because I disagree with some of what's happening. And I assume, it was kind of a lie that just kept rolling down the slope, and no one was I know brave and honest enough at any stage before, it just exploded to say, well, that's enough is enough. We can't do this. That's not who we are, and we can't allow for this to go on.
And all this seems to have backfired, right? Because this scandal has overshadowed the original abuse case, what was documented on the video and the charges against the soldiers. And to make things even more complicated, the Palestinian who was assaulted seems to have been returned to Gaza in the ceasefire deal. So presumably he won't be able to testify. So do we just write off the alleged abuses that occurred at Sde Teiman and say, it's just been subsumed by this larger scandal?
I agree. I think the main concern that comes out of this case is that it's being used, the allegations, serious allegations against the military advocate general are now, I think, being harnessed and used as an excuse and a pretext by others, within the government and supporting the government to advance goals that yet have nothing to do, with the rule of law to the contrary. So first, we're hearing that the calls to drop the case altogether, the abuse case against the involved soldiers, right? We're hearing even the Minister of Defense, who have been, tweeting on this issue frantically since last week, is calling it a blood libel. Here, it's important to stress, right, that there is apparently no sound evidence, that justified the filing indictments against the soldiers. So that's one thing. We also hearing the Minister of Justice and others using this as a pretext to try to further weaken the establishment of the Attorney General, trying to delegitimize the Attorney General, trying to put her out of the investigation of the incident. And I think it's also being used as a pretext not to investigate thoroughly and seriously the storming into the Sde Teiman base. I think, and then here I'm making, I think a reasoned assumption. Part of the political pressure to look into the leak of the video from Sde Teiman is that, we need to bear in mind that at the background, we also have a very and far more serious investigation around a leak, and that's the leaking of security classified documents by people in the close vicinity of the prime minister, right? That the Qatar scandal and the leak of classified documents to the German newspaper, the Bild. And I think there's somewhat an attempt to create an equivalence between the two affairs, even though I think there are basic and fundamental differences between them. So the concern is that, something that was done by the military advocate general, apparently, in an attempt to try and protect the notion of the rule of law, even though, it deteriorated into something far more serious, is now being used by those who are opponents, I think, of the notion of the rule of law in Israel in order to advance their goals. So yeah, it's almost tragic the way that things are unfolding.
The ultimate boomerang.
Right.
To wrap up, Eran, we just have had a new military advocate general appointed. I'm interested in what you think of him and the appointment process. And going forward, given all that has been damaged here, all that can be potentially damaged, what do you think he needs to do? What needs to happen in order to repair what can be repaired, minimize further damage? And do you trust the new appointee to carry this forward?
So under the military justice law, the military advocate general is appointed not by the chief of general staff, but by the minister of defense. And the idea originally was to, ensure the professional independence of the military advocate general. That the fact that even though he is reporting to the chief of staff on professional matters, he would be completely independent. So the way that the appointment goes is that the Minister of Defense appoints an individual at the recommendation of the Chief of General Staff. A few years ago, a public committee recommended that the consent of the Attorney General would also be part of the process, and the law amended accordingly, even to enhance even further the independence of the military advocate general. It was adopted by the Security Cabinet. It never came into realization, so the law has not been changed. I think that there's an enormous task for Advocate Itai Ophir, a former legal advisor for the Minister of Defense, because now he needs to. I think there is a blow to the public trust, both within the IDF and in Israeli society, and perhaps also overseas, a blow to the trust in the military justice system. So he has the enormous task of trying to rebuild this trust. And everything, while there's a criminal investigation still ongoing, while we still don't know who exactly, within the ranks was actually involved in the cover-up, was actually involved in misleading the court. I think it's a very important test. We can't have a military without a very robust military justice system. We can't ensure that, integrate the rule of law to all aspects of IDF conduct without a strong military advocate general corps. And we won't be able to defend our soldiers and commanders from legal risks overseas if we don't have an independent and fully functioning military justice system. So I do wish him best of luck in this enormous task lying ahead of him.
Dr. Eran Shamir-Borer, Director of the Center for National Security and Democracy at the Israel Democracy Institute. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and helping to explain this very complicated and very troubling matter.
Thank you very much, Alison.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Eran Shamir-Borer, and to producer Dan Brumer and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you are inclined to do so, leave us a 5-star rating so that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.